Good morning. We are back here social distancing in John's office for the last of our August series talking about introductions to the New Testament. And now I'm killing two birds with one stone with this whole scene here in this whole series. As you know, I'm teaching an online class at Gardner Webb. So I'm just taking the research that I'm doing for my online class and I'm applying it to a Sunday school lesson. So that does help me out a little bit. The interesting thing about teaching online this year is that we lost our textbooks, so we had to change textbooks. So that means I've got to learn new stuff and write new lectures and all that kind of stuff. It was so much easier when I could just take what I did the last time I taught and transfer it over, but that's not going to work this time. Probably a challenge that I need to accept and do some new reading, so we're going to work on that and make sure we get that done. My students are going to be mad because I'm going to be behind all semester, but that doesn't surprise anybody. So I want to start today, and let's get into the Gospels themselves a little bit. Let's talk about Matthew and Luke and some differences between the two Gospels. Now, this is a little bit of a simplified version of some larger scholarship and some larger study that people do. Matthew is placed first in the New Testament, not because it was written first, but because it is the easiest transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Mark is actually most likely written before Matthew. However, Matthew is what we would call the Jewish gospel. Very concerned with showing how Jesus connects with prophecy and how Jesus connects with the God of the Old Testament and making sure that we understand how those texts and those passages led us to the work that Jesus is currently doing. Often in Matthew's gospel, you'll hear the words, "This was written this was done to fulfill what was said in this book of the Old Testament," or in this section of the Old Testament. So we have that really strong connection. So it made sense to put Matthew first. If you're going to get through with the Old Testament, then you kind of ease into the New Testament by looking at what Matthew has to say, and it's a good transition. Luke's gospel, which I told you last week was my favorite, is much more of what we might call a Gentile gospel. Now, it does make strong connections to the Jewish faith and to the Old Testament, but it also has a tinge of going towards non-Jewish people. One of the things I like to say about Luke's gospel is it pushes us towards greater equity throughout the text. The role of women is very important in the Gospel of Luke. The role of the poor is very important in the Gospel of Luke. While Matthew is actually harder on the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Sanhedrin and those types of Jewish leaders, Luke has a little bit of a snarkier tone with Jesus in talking to those people. And he shows more about how Jesus moves towards not just Jewish people, because all through Matthew, what we hear is that Jesus is here to bring the gospel to the Jews. Then you start to ease towards people who are not Jewish. Luke's gospel kind of takes a full turn towards all people, and it's a more universal gospel. And the way I want to illustrate that is I want to talk about some passages that we don't talk, and I'm not going to read all this because I will bore you to death if I read all of Matthew chapter 1. Because Matthew chapter 1 has the genealogy of Jesus. And this person beget this person, and this person beget this person, and this person beget this person, and so on and so on and so forth, all through to lead up through David, and then show how David leads to Jesus. Now, but here's some interesting points about that. In Matthew 1, it says, it starts the book with genealogy. Now, let's keep in mind, if you're Jewish, heritage is vitally important to you, especially at this time when the Jews have basically had 400 years of what we call the intertestamental period, 400 years of very little of the voice of God speaking to them. There are some events that happen in there where God interacts with them and God speaks to them, but it's kind of a dead period to them. The texts are sparse. There's more persecution, there's more scattering of the Jewish people. They're conquered people at this point. They are under the rule of the Romans by the time we get to Matthew's gospel. And so they're not feeling real good about themselves. So in order to kind of keep track of who they are and what they're called to do, they cling very tightly to the past. And that's one of the things that we always do, and we have to be really careful about how we do it. We can cling so tightly to what used to be that we forget to look at what is or what God requires of us in the present and in the future. And in a way, they're kind of doing that, which is where we get a lot of the stories of the Pharisees. They wanted us to go back to the teaching of the law, a strict adherence, a literal interpretation, if you will, of the Jewish law. And that was a bit of a problem if you have this guy, Jesus, coming in saying, well, I'm the fulfillment of the law. Or that law doesn't, you're looking at that the wrong way. That's not how you're called to look at it. So Matthew's trying to make the case that Jesus is both connected to the history of Israel and that he is speaking towards the future of Israel. So what he does in his genealogy is he says right from the get-go, hey, this is really important. An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So if you can connect to David and you connect to Abraham, you're in pretty good stead in the Jewish community. That's kind of important. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zahar by Tamar, and on and on and on. So we start off Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and that's where Matthew begins his genealogy. So he connects us clearly to the history, to the past, to what was and what God was doing up to the point that Jesus came onto the scene. Luke is a little bit different. Now keep in mind, both Luke and Matthew are the two Gospels that contain the story of Jesus' birth. Luke goes right into Jesus' birth. His chapter 1 is Jesus shows up on the scene, or Jesus is coming to the scene. Now he does some leading up to that with stories of Zechariah the priest and the story of the coming of John the Baptist. And then we get into the story of Mary and Joseph and Jesus' birth. But then he waits on over till chapter 4 before he starts going into his genealogy. And chapter 3, before he goes into his genealogy. And he starts his in a different way. He starts with Jesus and then works his way back. So in other words, he's more concerned with the here and now, with the present tense, what Jesus is here to do, and then he links his Jesus all the way back to Adam. So for Matthew, he's concerned with telling the Jewish people, this guy is here for you. He is connected to you. He is a part of your people. He is a son of David, a son of Abraham, which is vitally important. Luke, on the other hand, expands it. And he says, Jesus is not just a son of Abraham or a son of David, he's a son of Adam. Which means everyone from the beginning of history is affected by what Jesus is here to do, and what Jesus says, and what Jesus has become as the post-Easter Jesus. Luke also includes two people who would be considered black. He includes some people who would be considered criminals, arguably some people who would be considered prostitutes. So, he also is careful to connect Jesus to the underclass, to the downtrodden. It's not that those genealogies are necessarily different, it's simply that Luke makes some connections that Matthew doesn't necessarily find as important. So we have to kind of put those two together and see how they're vital. So what is the importance of all this? Well, first of all, we have to understand that Jesus is not devoid of history. It's not that Jesus comes to overthrow the Old Testament, I'm not really an Old Testament guy. I'm a New Testament guy. But the further I study the New Testament, the better I am seeing my view of the Old Testament become. Because I'm beginning to understand where some of that is going. Now, I don't have an explanation for a lot of things in the Old Testament, and I got a lot of questions when I get to heaven about what in the world was going on in this passage or that passage of the Old Testament. And I've had some interesting questions put to me by students and youth group members about some of the things that the Old Testament says. But if you can kind of get through that, and see the connections between Jesus of the Old Testament, between the Old Testament and Christ in Matthew and eventually in Luke, then you can see some really great pictures of what God is doing throughout history and continues to do throughout history. So Matthew connects to that history, but then he turns around and says, particularly in Matthew chapter 5, this history is not what you think it is. The fulfillment of the law and the meaning of the law is much deeper and richer and more critical than you thought it was. Which is why he says, not just an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but turn the other cheek. You have heard that it was said, you should do these things, but I say to you, you've got to go even beyond that in your life and in your discipleship. And then we get to Luke's gospel, where Luke really throws the doors open. And Luke says, look, it's not just about Jewish people or men or those who are leaders or teachers or wealthy or those kind of people. Jesus is here for all people. Jesus is here for humanity. Not just for a portion of humanity, but for all of humanity. Excuse me. One of the things that we have to see is that we are very much at a place in our history as a country and as a church where we have a tendency to cling to what was. You know, I remember back in the 50s when everybody went to church every Sunday. And that's what we did. I remember my dad talking about sitting on the front porch eating Sunday lunch, and my grandmother coming home. And it always used to make her mad because she would walk home from church and her family would be on the front porch waiting on her to come in and cook dinner, which she did with on a regular basis. But those times sitting on the front porch, riding around, visiting, doing those types of things, and we kind of idealize that time. And certainly it was in some ways maybe better. In some ways maybe a slower pace of life or a more family-oriented pace of life. And I don't think we can diminish that. I think those things are very important. And there are parts of me that wish we still had a little more of that in these modern times. But these are the times in which we live. We live in a day and age when communicating through video and over the internet is, for a lot of people, an acceptable form of communication about Jesus Christ. We live in a day and an age when things that we thought were okay are not such a big deal back in the past. Maybe they are a big deal. Maybe they should have always been a big deal. But they certainly are now. So when we cling to what was, we have to make sure we're clinging to what was for God's way of doing things, not just what was for our way of doing things. The days are probably not coming back when we have church buildings going up all over the place and our primary goal of church is to build a bigger facility. In fact, we may be coming on a day and age when we have to have multi-uses for our facilities and where we have to think of very different and creative ways, maybe even to operate without one. Now, don't tell John I said that, because I don't want him saying, well, Tom said we didn't have to go back to the building. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that our ultimate goal should not be to cling to things, to cling to stuff, and to cling to a way of life that's probably not coming back. Our calling, much as it was for Luke, is to look at what we can do going forward and how we can be going forward. There may have been a time when certain statues and certain flags and certain things like that were such just a part of our culture. That's just the way it was. But that doesn't mean that's the way it is or the way that it ought to be. There were certain things that we used to be able to say. And I even think back to my time in high school and some of the things I said as a young man in high school that I never would have said in front of my mother and father, but they were acceptable in front of the guys or in front of other people. Now we know better. Now we've learned better. They probably weren't acceptable then or shouldn't have been, and they certainly aren't now. We can't say, well, why is that a big deal now? It wasn't a big deal back then, because times change. Much like these Gospels change. Matthew starts by leading us in with the Jewish way of Jesus, And then Luke takes us a step further by showing us that Jesus expands his ministry beyond just the Jewish people to whom he came to save. That he came to save all of humanity. If we are going to go on a sincere journey of discipleship, we have to see both the Jesus of the genealogy of Matthew and the Jesus of the genealogy of Luke. One that tells us how we're connected to our past and what God has always been doing, and one that leads us into a future where God is doing more than we ever expected. So rather than clinging, which Matthew clearly does not endorse, let us understand our history, but let us see how it leads us into a future that may be harder. We often talk about a glorious future in Jesus Christ. Folks, the future may get harder before it gets easier. It may get tougher to walk than before it gets easier to walk through the path that Jesus has laid for us. So let us be willing to walk that path, no matter where it takes us, just as Luke tells us, all the way to all the people who need to know the love of Christ. And let us be willing to change our hearts and our methods and our approaches to life in order that others may live. Thank you for this time. I've enjoyed being with you the last 5 weeks, and I don't know if Angela has enjoyed having to corral me for video or not, but it has been fun. I certainly enjoy doing this, and we hope that one of these days we will be back in church together with you. I hope that's coming. We'll see how that goes, but until then, stay connected, keep learning, and we'll keep doing this whenever we have the opportunity. Blessings, and everybody have a wonderful week.